Halloween can uncover strange and unsettling moments that linger in memory. Each of these experiences comes from first-hand reports and anecdotes. If you enjoy these stories, consider liking, subscribing, and hitting the bell notification. I'd love to know where you are watching from. Now, let's begin. I was 19 and babysitting for a family 2 houses down on Halloween night. The 2 kids, 7 and 9, were sticky from candy and tacked up with glow stick bracelets, and their parents had left a list on the kitchen counter with emergency numbers and a note that said, "Be back by 10. I told them we'd do 1 loop of the block, let them run the porch to porch part, and then come straight home for hot chocolate. The street was a single row of houses with a patch of scrubby trees sitting where the cul-de-sac narrowed. A line of houses and then the break in the street where the pavement met a dirt path and the dark, thin trees. We started slow. The younger kid wanted to show off his vampire fangs. The older one kept checking his haul and swapping pieces. Around the 3rd house, a car with its radio on pulled up across the street and a man in a rabbit mask leaned out and shouted a silly joke. The kids shouted back and laughed. That made the night feel normal again. Parents were on porches carrying thermoses. Someone had a small radio playing old pop, and the orange glow from carved pumpkins made curtains dappled with light. Halfway down the block, under a street light that cast a half circle of weak light, I noticed someone standing just off the sidewalk by the scrubby trees. At first, I thought it was a neighbor in costume, a dude doing the whole creepy clown bit, white face paint, a cheap red wig, a jacket too small for him. But what stopped me was the way he stood, hands low at his sides, as if waiting. He wasn't waving. He wasn't joking. He wasn't talking to anyone. He had a small paper bag in one hand. The blinking light from someone's novelty nose made the silhouette look wrong, as if someone had stuck a cheap, pulsing toy into the shape of a person. The kids ran ahead to a porch light. A woman opened the door and the older boy grinned and said trick or treat. He got a candy bar, then turned to run, and that's when the man by the trees moved. He came out of the shadow with a slow, deliberate step and walked across the strip of lawn toward the kids. He didn't call out. He didn't laugh. He just walked and held up the paper bag, like he wanted them to see it. "Hey, you can't just..." I started, my mouth already forming the sentence when the kid nearest him, the 7-year-old, froze and looked at the man instead of at me. The man crouched and, in a voice that was too calm for what he was wearing, said, "Want money? I'll give you $1 if you come with me." It wasn't a joke. He wasn't putting on a show. He had a single dollar bill folded and he held it like he expected a hand to come take it. There wasn't time to think about how stupid that was. The younger boy's eyes went wide. He took a step toward the man. I dropped my candy bag and sprinted in front of him and grabbed his sleeve. "No," I said. My voice came out flat, the kind people use when they need kids to stop moving. "We're with her. We're with me." The clown, I still think of him that way because the hair and makeup made it easier to call him that in my head, didn't argue. He straightened, looked at me like he was measuring whether I was worth wasting time on, and then he glanced toward the mouth of the path where the trees swallowed the end of the street. He lifted his chin toward the dirt, and then toward the dark inside the trees, as if gesturing. He said, "There's a way through. Quiet. Come check the money." Nobody else on the block reacted. A porch light half a block over threw some faces into relief. A couple sat with takeout and shouted hello at some passing teens. I slammed my hand on the younger kid's shoulder and pulled. He resisted. That small, stupid rebellion kids do when they think something exciting is happening and they're being held back. The older boy, who'd been standing by the steps, watched like he was trying to work out what play this was. The clown smiled in a way that did not reach his eyes and folded the paper bag, then walked back 3 steps, then toward the trees, as if he wanted someone to follow. I did the rational thing I could think of. I took out my phone and kept it in my hand so it was obvious, like headlights for trouble. "We're leaving," I said. "Now." I stepped between the kids and the path. The clown stopped. For a second, we held a triangle of space. Me, my phone light, him. He cocked his head, then laughed a little, like that sound was the only thing that mattered, and then he bent down and pulled out from the bag something shiny and metallic. I couldn't make it out at first because the streetlight threw the shape into bright white. It was the size of a kitchen knife. When he straightened, someone on a porch across the street swore, and a dog started barking. The kids were suddenly loud, pulling at me, saying they wanted to go home. I took their hands and walked backward, deliberately slow, so that the clown couldn't claim we were running away from him. He matched our pace at first, then broke into a jog and then into a short, ugly sprint. He never tried to come at us from the front. He angled toward the mouth of the trees and cut across the lot and disappeared into the dark between two trunks. That was when the street changed tone. A man I'd seen earlier with a flashlight and a beer stepped off his stoop and yelled something about calling the police. Another neighbor had a rifle slung in a gun case, and he came out and fired a shot into the sky, a single loud pop that made every car 3 houses over roll their windows up. The kids screamed. The younger one flat out sobbed, and 100 small things moved at once, porch lights flipping off, women pulling children closer with a shaken face. That rabbit mask guy from the car backing away and driving off. The man with the rifle went to the tree line and I stayed on the sidewalk like someone who doesn't belong in an argument about what to do next. We called the number on the parents' list and told them we were heading home. They were on their way back within 5 minutes. Someone from 3 doors down walked the kids to the porch and sat with them until the parents arrived. The police took statements. They asked if I'd recorded anything, and I handed them my phone. On the footage, you can see a dark shape moving. You can see me shouting. You can see a short smear of light where the knife reflected as the clown turned and vanished into the trees. They told us later that they'd gotten calls up and down the county that night, strange sightings and people in costume outside of houses acting like they wanted to pull kids into secluded places. A patrolman we talked to, someone calm enough that I almost trusted him, told me not to go near dark tree lines on Halloween and to keep kids on lit streets, which felt like the kind of advice you give people who've already been burned, useful but late. At home, I sat on the back steps after I'd put the kids to bed, watching the moon tilt above the roofline. The parents left me an extra 20 and a note that said thanks, and I wrote a short message to my sister telling her not to make me do that again. I didn't post the video online. For the rest of the week, I checked the neighborhood page and local feeds and found other posts. People saying they'd seen a clown with lights, someone reporting a person offering money, an older man saying a kid had been chased and pushed through someone's yard. No one had a clear picture. No one had an arrest. I slept the next day like a body that had given up for a few hours. And when I told the story later, to friends, to a coworker, to anyone who asked about Halloween, I left out some things that felt useless in retelling, like the smell of the caramel on the kids' fingers or the exact phrase the clown used. What stuck was the way a costume changed the meaning of a person, how cheap makeup can make attention feel dangerous, and the way a single, ridiculous thing, a blinking red nose on a stranger in the dark, can rearrange an ordinary night into something crooked. Story 2. I was 22 and short on rent money when Mrs. H asked me to house sit for the weekend. Her place was the kind of old wood house that sits back from the road behind a row of maples, the kind where Halloween looks good on the porch. My job was simple, she said. Keep the porch light on, hand out candy until 10, bring her mail inside, water the plants. I agreed because it was simple, because the money would cover a month, and because I told myself nothing ever actually happens in quiet towns like ours. That Halloween started like any other. Families drifted down the street, kids in haphazard costumes, parents smiling and calling out instructions under breath. I sat at the kitchen table with a bowl of candy and my phone, answering the door every few minutes and slipping a handful to whoever knocked. At around 9, the last of the trick-or-treaters thinned to a couple of shoes disappearing down the sidewalk. I locked the door, turned on the living room lamp, and told myself I could relax for the rest of the night. At 11, I heard something in the upstairs closet. It was a soft, steady scuffing, as if someone was moving boxes or stepping across bare floorboards. I froze, listening. The house had always creaked, old pipes, old weather, but this had a rhythm, like someone trying to be quiet and failing. I told myself it was a raccoon in the attic or a branch scraping the roof and that I should go back to whatever show I had paused. Instead, I stood and walked upstairs. The spare bedroom's closet had been left unlocked. It was the kind of closet that smelled like old linens and cedar. The kind of closet people pile things into, then forget. A loose board in the floor near the back caught my eye. It wasn't just loose. It had been lifted recently and set down wrong. There were small, muddy smudges on the underside, and a faint line in the dust, as if someone had dragged something through after crawling under. My skin tightened. I called out, "Hello?" in a voice I tried to keep level. There was a pause, and then a movement, a shuffle. A thin voice said, "You can see me, huh?" I swung the closet light on and climbed to my knees. The crawl space was low, the kind you usually only see when you have to fetch the vacuum. Someone had made a bed there, thin foam and a stained blanket tucked against the wall. There were wrappers from energy bars, a paperback book with the spine taped, a small plastic toy with one eye chewed off. My heart beat loud and stupid. I crawled in and found prints in the dust where someone had been walking between the rafters and the floor. On the drywall, written faintly with a finger, were dates and times, and, below them, a set of tiny check marks. He crawled out when I moved. He was in his late 40s, maybe older, skinny as if the house had been feeding him just enough to keep going. He wore an old hoodie and his hair stuck out like he'd slept in it for days. For a second I didn't understand the calm in his face, just the flatness. He said, "I didn't mean to scare you. I stay quiet." "How long?" I asked. It came out small. "Long enough." He shrugged. "I pick the busy houses. People give you candy and don't look inside. Halloween is perfect, right? So much movement. No one checks the crawl space. I sleep there. I make sure nothing's missing." He spoke as if this was a fact about the weather. I moved back toward the door, my hand finding the knob. "You can't be here. People are coming back. The neighbors." He laughed, and it wasn't light. "You think I want to hurt anyone?" "No. Terrible things happen when people want to cause trouble. I don't do bad like that. I just watch. I learn. I keep my head down." I remember how oddly reasonable he sounded. He wasn't the hulking intruder that movies show. He was a person who could be explained away if you sat in the right light. But there were other things. I found a notebook tucked under the blanket. In it, neat columns recorded house numbers and times. Beside some entries were short descriptions. Porch light on, dog barking, grandmother home, presence visible through window. Some lines had been circled. At the back of the book were the names of streets, and next to them, a different set of marks. Tiny notches like tally marks, and next to those, dates. "Why are these circled?" I asked. He rubbed his hands together like he was cold. "Favorites," he said. "Some houses, they leave things. Keys, radios, little bags. I keep them. Reminders." I swear I didn't understand at first. I thought he meant knickknacks. Then I found a small Ziploc bag tucked under the spare mattress of the crawl space. Inside were 5 house keys on a cheap ring, some change, and a red plastic witch's finger from someone's candy bucket. My stomach dropped. "I should call someone," I said. It felt stupid and huge at once. If I called the police and he ran, would he take the keys with him? Would he take more? He looked at me, then down at the ring of keys, then up like he made a decision. "You could," he said, "or we can do it your way. You can pretend you didn't see me and go on handing out candy. I won't be here when you come back. I'll be gone by morning." "Why would I believe you?" He smiled then, quick and almost human. "Because I like Halloween. It's honest. It's everyone outside, showing who they are. I don't take what people need. I take what they don't care about. Keys, little things. It's a stupid system, but it's mine. You call, you get a report. Maybe they'll find where I hide. Maybe they won't. Either way, I'm not looking for trouble." I left the closet then. I walked downstairs, went outside, and started my car. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. I told myself I could drive a few blocks and call Mrs. H. I could ask the neighbors. I could be rational, practical. The glow of the streetlight threw my shadow long across the driveway. I sat in the driver's seat and pretended to breathe. He left while I sat there. I didn't see him go. When I came back up the walk to get my purse, there was a small carved pumpkin where the welcome mat would usually be. It wasn't one of Mrs. H's decorations. It had been cheap and hand-carved, one of those styrofoam jobs that are supposed to look like real. Inside, a small scrap of paper. In even, careful handwriting, it said, "Thanks for the light." The paper had a single check mark under it, like in his book. I called Mrs. H. She told me to call the police. I did. They came with flashlights and gloves and a professional flatness that made my stomach twist. They took the list, the keys, the notebook. They looked in the crawl space and found the mattress, the wrappers, the toy. They looked in closets and under beds, and they searched the basement. They knocked on doors. They asked me the same questions twice. They told me to stay at a friend's house until morning. They did not find him. They asked if I wanted to press charges for trespassing, and I couldn't figure out what to press charges for. He hadn't stolen anything much. He hadn't attacked me. He'd been there, quietly, for who knew how long, and he'd left a thank you note like he was leaving a tip. The police filed a report. The detective's voice was even and patient and somehow made the whole thing feel like paperwork instead of a person living under a neighbor's floorboards for weeks. Weeks later, months later, I still wake in the middle of the night and check my closet. I moved out of that rental because staying there felt like ignoring the fact that someone had been in the walls where I slept. The house sits empty now. The listing flaps in the wind sometimes. I think about the check marks in the book. I think about how small the things he took were, how carefully he recorded each visit like a hobbyist cataloging specimens. I think about Halloween and how a holiday built on trickery and disguise offers perfect cover for something that is not a trick. Story 3. I took my 3-year-old trick-or-treating around the complex because his father was on call, and I did not want to leave him alone with a babysitter he did not know yet. We had one of those small fabric pumpkin bags he insisted on carrying, and he wore a dinosaur costume that made him walk like he was trying not to step on his own tail. It was early evening and people were handing out candy from their stoops, waving from inside doorways, calling to other kids across the parking lot. We moved slow because he liked to stop and look at every decoration. At the third building, a man opened his door and grinned in a way that made me step back without thinking. He was in his 60s, hair close cropped, and he had a living room that looked like someone had taken a Halloween catalog and installed it on the walls. Fake cobwebs, a plastic tree with tiny blinking lights, a pile of old travel trunks stacked like stage props. The TV at the far end of the room was on with a slideshow running. He said, "Come on in. We always show the slides. Some people like to see the kids after." My kid tugged at my hand because he wanted to look at the lights. I almost said no. We have to keep moving. But the man seemed harmless in a way that made me relax. He had a bowl of candy on a table and an easy voice. He asked what my son's name was and called him by it when he handed him a lollipop. I remember thinking the way he said the name like he knew it before I did. The slideshow had 50, maybe hundreds of still images. I thought it was photos from past Halloweens. Everyone in their costumes, grainy flash photos that made the fake teeth look more ridiculous. Then I realized I recognized some of the faces. Kids from the block. Kids I had seen on the path when I walked Evan to daycare. There was a little girl who lived 2 doors down in a fairy costume. A boy who always rode his bike around the lot wearing a cape. The pictures were all taken in front of houses I knew. They were not posted by the parents. The man clicked through them like someone showing off a private album. The camera had caught the front steps, the porch rails, the exact folds of a jacket. Some pictures were close, cropped so you saw the child's face and the porch light behind them. Others were taken from across the parking lot, flattened perspective, as if from a long lens. I asked where he had gotten the pictures. He said he liked to document Halloween, that people forget how they dressed, that he made a collage every year. He named a few kids by their nicknames and I answered because I thought naming was neighborly. He pointed at a photo of my son with his lollipop and said he had been out early handing out candy to kids who were too little. My stomach did the little hollow thing it does when you realize you have been off by 1 step. I told him we should be going. He stood in the doorway, and for a moment it felt like a choice. I stepped back out into the cool air and tugged Evan away because his little hand had already started to reach for the next house. We walked another block and I told myself I was overreacting. People put together slideshows, people took pictures, old people had hobbies. But the next day I found a flyer on my windshield in the parking lot. It had a picture from the slideshow printed on cheap paper, my son with his lollipop, blurred porch in the background, and on the bottom a web address handwritten in blue ink. I folded it up and put it on the kitchen counter because I did not know what else to do. I did not call the police the first morning because calling the police felt like admitting something real had happened and I was not sure yet where to put that kind of fear. That night I could not sleep. I kept thinking about the angles of the photos. How did someone get close enough to a porch to shoot without being noticed? How did they take pictures from across the lot without anyone seeing a tripod? In the morning, I walked the route from our apartment to the old man's building. I walked slowly, checking porches, looking at the trees for anything that might hide a camera. On the mail kiosk, I ran into a woman I knew from the daycare line. She had a folding chair with a lamp on it and a stack of paper cups. She told me she had been there the night before handing out juice, and that a man had come by and asked if she left her porch light on. She described him, and I felt the skin on my arms tighten again. We went together to the man's door and knocked. He answered and did not seem surprised to see us. When I told him I wanted to know more about the slideshow, he offered to show us the rest of it. I said no thank you and asked if he made the photos himself. He said yes. His nephew had set the camera a long time ago and he liked to see the neighborhood on Halloween. I asked if he had permission to take pictures of the kids and he shrugged like it was a small thing. He said the images were for his family, that people in the complex knew about it, that it was just tradition. Something about the way he put his hand on the TV remote, like he was the keeper of the show, made the woman from the daycare frown. She said we wanted to look at his equipment. He laughed and said there was nothing to see, and the laugh cut off when I asked him if he had an SD card or a storage drive from the camera. The man blinked, and for the first time he hesitated. Then he admitted he kept the memory cards in a box in the trunk that sat under his coffee table. He went to fetch it. While he was reaching, I noticed a child's plastic jack planted on the shelf as if it had been staged. The pumpkin had a tiny hole on the side where a little lens could be hidden. I must have moved slowly because the woman asked if she could sit down and she did not move her eyes from the pumpkin. He came back with a cardboard shoebox and opened it. Inside were several little memory cards, some labeled in black marker with dates, some lettered with street names. He handed one to me as if it were no different than passing a coin. I took it to my car. I put it into my laptop and the first thing that popped up was a folder of pictures organized by file name. There were thumbnails and then full images. I did not go through them all at once, but I scrolled far enough to confirm that the man had been taking pictures of children on porches and in yards, sometimes from across the parking lot with a long lens, sometimes from a closer angle where a child's face filled the frame and you could see their breath and the pattern on their coat. Some images were time-stamped, down to the minute. One folder had short video clips. I watched one that made my chest squeeze. A small camera, mounted low in a fake bale of hay on a neighbor's porch, had recorded a child coming to the door, the parent leaning down to unbutton a coat, and then the camera panned up slightly and settled on the child's face as if it was studying it. The clip lasted 30 seconds, and the framing made me feel like the camera itself was a person that had settled into position to look. I called the police and I called the woman who had been with me. The officers arrived with a quiet that made the whole thing feel like a set call. They took our statements, and then they took the box and the cards. They went back quickly to the man's apartment with a tow of uniforms and a pair of techs. I sat in my car with my son asleep against my shoulder in his car seat while someone read a report to me through a window. They found more equipment tucked inside hollow books, inside a fake skull, inside the base of a motion light. There were lenses that could be hidden in gnomes, in birdhouses, in pumpkins. They found a monitor with multiple live feeds and a hard drive full of images and clips. The text said the hard drive had images dating back years, not just Halloween's. There were stills of kids at birthday parties, of them standing at porches, of bikes left parked on lawns. Some clips were taken inside yards from positions no one would normally stand in. The officers worked quietly and did not talk about what they were seeing. They arrested him for voyeurism and for installing cameras without consent. They cataloged the footage and told me they would try to notify parents. I felt both relieved and like something had broken in me. The man kept saying he loved Halloween, that it was a community thing, that his slides were nothing more than a record. It felt wrong, the way he kept saying the same thing and not explaining how he had managed to put cameras in places no one noticed. At some point, an officer came to the car and told me they had found a folder on the drive labeled with our building number. Inside were dozens of stills and clips of night footage pointed at our unit's porch and windows. One clip showed an infrared view of my son's bedroom window on a late October night when he had woken up coughing. The camera angle matched a small oak tree across from our building that had a fake owl hidden in it. The idea that something had been watching our house while we slept made my throat close. They said they would keep me updated, and they gave me a case number. I took my son inside and left the pumpkin flyer on the counter like I had left it the first day. I did not throw anything away that night. The man was charged and later sentenced to a term for unlawful surveillance. People in the complex started taking down decorations if they had places that looked like convenient camera spots. We taped our windows from the inside for a week and then replaced the tape with curtains. I still look at the oak tree when I pass it, and I keep thinking about what people put in plain sight that they never expect to be a lens. Story 4. I was working nights that October because the bar needed extra drivers on weekend shifts and the pay was good, enough to fix the dent in my truck and buy groceries for the week. It was Halloween, late, the kind of cold that made the breath hang like a little ghost. I picked up a woman outside the old dance hall at just after 1 in the morning. She stood under the flicker of a street lamp, wearing a white dress that looked like it belonged to someone from another decade, hair rolled and set the way my grandmother used to do hers. She stepped into the back seat and folded her hands in her lap like she was cold, though the air inside the truck was warm from the heater. She told me, plain, that she needed to go to the cemetery gate, and when I asked which gate, she only said the one at the far end of the road, the one with the iron posts. There were a dozen other ways to say where she wanted to go, but she used that one and I drove. She talked in a voice that didn't match the look of her dress, like the small, steady voice you hear on late-night radio, saying things about the dance being good that night and that the music had made her laugh. I listened and kept the radio low. Outside the truck, the road was nearly empty, just the shimmer of taillights and the occasional slow car passing. When we passed under the bridge, a dog barked in the distance, and she flinched like someone had touched her shoulder. I glanced at the rear view and saw that she had her eyes on the window, watching the fence posts move past. She showed me her hand when I slowed for a curve, palm up, and it was white as tissue. I hand her my lighter by reflex because she looked as if she might drop the cigarette she didn't have. She only smiled, close-lipped, and tucked her hand back under the skirt. It was the kind of small, unexplainable thing that settles in your chest and refuses to leave. We drove farther than I expected. It's easy to lose track of distance at night, the map of the town unspooling differently after midnight. She asked me to stop at the pullout just before the gate, where the weeds grabbed at the shoulder of the road and the sign leaned like it had been forgotten. I cut the engine and we sat for a beat with the truck light on, the inside a small square of gold in the dark. She put both hands on the back of the seat and turned to look at me directly for the first time and said, quietly, "Will you wait?" I told her I could if that's what she wanted. She said, "Just long enough," and gave a tiny laugh that sounded like someone testing a lock. I climbed out to open the door for her because it felt like the right thing to do, like being polite to someone I'd never met. When I reached back and pulled the handle, the seat was empty. I stood there with the truck door open and the night pressing in like something that wants the light off. The seat cushion was rumpled, the imprint of a body just seconds old, but no coat, no purse, nothing. I called out, "Hey?" into the dark, and my voice sounded thin. There was no reply but the rustle of weeds. I walked the shoulder toward the gate a little, flashlight in my pocket and my breath already making small clouds in front of me. At the edge of the pullout there was a single white glove on the gravel, the kind with little embroidered dots on the palm. I picked it up. It had a small monogram in faded blue thread, 3 letters I could not make out at first because the thread had bled with age. I folded it into my palm and walked back to the truck. When I climbed in the cab, the ache in my chest had turned into a slow cold. The glove sat on the seat between the maps and the empty lunchbox. I started the truck and for a half-mile could not stop looking in the mirror, expecting to see the dress weave into the dark. Nothing ever went past us. When I finally headed back toward the dance hall, my hands shook while I reached for the lighter, and it took a second to remember where I had put it. People who drive at night get used to unsettled things and call them paying the dues or the job. I told myself the woman had stepped out when she saw a friend, or that she had been a prankster, or that the glove had been some left-behind prop. I kept the glove folded and small because it felt wrong to throw it away. I took the glove to a friend who worked the ticket booth at the dance hall when I was next in. He knew the town's stories, the ones you only hear when someone has had a drink too many and the light is low enough that you think the tale is true. He said a woman in a white dress had died there many decades ago after a fight on the road, a car and a scream, that people sometimes saw her at the gate if you were driving late. The way he said it, with an easy shrug and a cigarette burning down between his fingers, made it sound like history, like a story that has been told and retold until it is woven into the nights. He asked me if I had seen her. I held the glove in the pocket of my jacket and lied, saying I had only found it on the road. He did not press further. I kept the glove because something felt wrong not to. Over the next few Halloweens, I worked the bar again, and every year there was a small number of calls to pick people up from the rear of the parking lot. And every year there were stories about a woman on the shoulder who vanished when you blinked. Once, a woman stumbled out to my truck, drunk and laughing, and said she'd seen a figure on the road in a dress. She described the dress the same way, and the old, polite voice she'd heard when she slowed. I watched her fingers worry at the collar of her sweatshirt, and she kept saying, "She looked like she was waiting." I stopped telling people what I had seen. Telling makes it more true, somehow, and I didn't want to invite anything else down these streets at night. The worst night came 2 years later. I was running a late shift and the truck had been idling at a light under a line of sycamores when a woman in a white dress walked onto the sidewalk in front of me and held up her hand, like she wanted the cab. I rolled the window down and asked, "Where to?" And she said the same thing, the gate at the far end. I told her to get in and she climbed into the back, smiling small, then put her hand against the window where my reflection was and said, "The road remembers," as if it had been waiting to say that for years. I remember the glove then, in my pocket, warm against my palm, The radio cut out to static for a few seconds as we passed under the bridge. The dash lights dimmed, then steadied. When we turned near the sign, she said, "Stop here," and I pulled over. I opened the door and there was that same empty space, and the glove under the seat, but now there was also a smear of something on the truck step like someone had dragged a skirt across it. I reached down and touched it, and my fingers came away smelling faintly of cigarette smoke and perfume that belonged to another century. I drove away that night with the glove between my fingers and a feeling in my teeth like you get when you bite something cold. I drove until the orange of the street lamps turned into the soft white of my neighborhood, and then I parked in my driveway and went inside. The glove sat on my kitchen counter until morning, and then I wrapped it in a paper towel and took it to the historical society where they keep old newspapers and town records. The woman behind the counter looked at the glove like she had seen 100 tiny ghosts, and then led me to a stack of yellowed clippings. There, in cramped print from the 1930s, was a short notice about a girl who left the dance hall in a white dress and was struck on the road on her way home. The name in the obituary matched the monogram on the glove. Story 5. I was 24 and working the afternoon shift at the public library when I decided to stop by the thrift store on my way home because I needed a last-minute costume for the library's Halloween story hour. My budget was small, and my standards were lower when the clock said 4:30, and I still did not have anything. The shop was one of those places that smells like old paper and winter coats, rows of things waiting for someone to make them new. In the back, hung on a sagging rack between a faded bridesmaid dress and a suit with one shoulder missing, was a child's costume. An old-fashioned jester outfit, faded orange and green, the paint on the little carved wooden mask flaking at the edges. It had a sewn-in name tag inside the collar, the thread brown with age, and the name was stitched in looping blue thread so small you could miss it if you weren't looking for seams. The woman at the counter said it came from a box the shop had bought at an estate sale and that they thought it had probably been in an attic for years. I shrugged and bought it because it already looked like it had a story inside it, and I told myself a story would do for an afternoon of reading to kids. That night at the library, the costume worked like a costume is supposed to work. I put it on in the staff restroom between shifts, and the fabric smelled like dust and old glue, like a basement where someone had kept things wrapped for a decade. The children loved the fringe and how the trousers bellied when I hopped, and the little bells at the cap made quiet, nervous music when I moved. Halfway through the third story, a kid in the front row pointed and said, "You look like the pretty lady from the picture," because the mask had that kind of goofy smiling face you see in old photos. After story hour, a couple of parents stuck around to thank the staff, and the night ended the way it usually does. We stacked chairs, swept up candy wrappers, and I hung the costume on the coat hook in my car because I did not want to drag it home smelling like fluorescent lights. When I got home, the costume felt heavier in the trunk than it should have. Inside my apartment, I left my keys on the table, lit a candle, and thought for 2 minutes about laundry. At 2 in the morning, I woke because it sounded like someone was small-footed and nervous in the hallway outside my bedroom. I froze and listened. The noise stopped like a radio switched off. I told myself it was my building settling, the usual things people say when something wakes you and you need a reason to stand and do nothing. I found the costume on the hallway floor with the mask propped against the shoe rack like someone had taken it off and left it there. The mask's painted smile had lost a sliver of paint on the left cheek. I would have left it on the floor and laughed at myself in the morning if my phone had not been dead and I had not needed the light. I picked the mask up, and for a second, in the way the wood reflected light, I thought I saw a child's small forehead reflected in the curve. I set everything on the couch and went to bed because it was rational and the hour was late, and because I had to work the next afternoon and the library's caffeine machine is a miracle I did not want to sabotage. The next evening, someone from the neighborhood brought in a box of donated books, and in the box, under a stack of National Geographics from 1987, was an old program from a community Halloween pageant with names printed in a font the way people used to set type. One of the names in the cast list matched the name on the tiny tag in the costume's collar. It was the same unusual name, and for a little while I just stood there, turning the program and the costume label over in my hands like they were ordinary pieces of paper. I went home and sat at my kitchen table and lined them up because some part of me wanted to see that coincidence spelled out. The name in the program had a note in pencil beside it someone had written decades ago, "One prize," and the costume tag's letters were worn where the thread had been rubbed raw. I started noticing things. On the bus home at night, there was a child who kept looking at me and then looking away, like the kid recognized the jester cap under my coat even though I had zipped it up and hidden it. At the stoplight by the grocery store, a toddler in a stroller reached for me and shrieked with delight because of the bells. The door at work jammed once and someone joked that things wanted attention and that if you give things attention, they stick to you. I laughed and set the mask on my shelf where everyone could see it because I liked that it looked theatrical and it made a good prop for the upcoming puppet workshop. 2 weeks after I bought it, cold started showing up inside the apartment at odd times. Not drafts that the landlord could fix, but a pocket of air like someone had opened a door to a basement inside the bedroom. The thermostat read the same number and my breath puffed and disappeared on mornings I had nowhere to be until noon. Once, when I was making tea, I found a long pencil line drawn on a scrap of paper leaning against the sugar jar. It was a child's drawing of a stage with curtains, and under the curtain on the paper, tiny stick figures were drawn holding hands in a circle. The drawing was on the type of paper that comes from the photocopy tray at work. I had not left that paper on the counter. I did not know why I kept finding things that felt like they fit with the costume. One night the costume was gone from the shelf. I remember the exact slant of the streetlight through the blinds, and how the dust looked like weather in the bright line. And I remember opening my hand and feeling only the empty hook. I did not leave my apartment that night. I checked under the bed, in the closet, in the laundry hamper, the trunk in my car, and then I checked the neighbor's trash chute because something in me, the part that acts before you tell it to be sensible, wanted it back. The chute was locked. I called the thrift shop and they put me on hold and then said they had not sold the costume again and that the woman who had brought that estate box in had been long gone. I went to sleep with the window cracked because the cool felt safer than the closed air. The next morning, there was a costume in the little patch of the stairwell landing between my floor and the next. It was folded neatly as if waiting, the mask propped on top like a head on a pillow. Someone had left a single photograph tucked under the mask's elastic strap. In the photo, a boy in a jester costume stood in front of a theater curtain and grinned with every tooth showing. On the back of the photo, in handwriting that could belong to a parent or a child, was the date of the pageant and a single line, "For Tommy." I do not have a Tommy, and the photograph was warm still where someone had put it down. I picked it up and the paper had the faint smell of old orange peel and something metallic like coins. I tried to give it away. I boxed the costume and took it back to the thrift shop, and the woman at the counter took it and said she would put it on the shelf and priced it with a little sticker and said thanks. I left with the odd, satisfied itch of someone who had done the right thing. That night I dreamt that I was on stage and all the lights were bulbs that had been around too long and they hummed like bees. When I woke up, I found a small shoe print in flour on my kitchen counter. Not my shoe, not the shoe I wore, but a child's size 8, dusted in white flour. There was flour on the floorboards under the window, leading away into the hallway and toward the stairwell. The flour made a faint path that ended under my door. I wrote a note and taped it to the costume's collar the day after. It said, in black marker, "If you left it here, take it." I felt ridiculous doing it. I felt like a person who had stepped into someone else's story and was trying to find their place to leave. For 2 days, nothing happened. On the third evening, the mask was back on my shelf, and my marker was smeared where the ink had bled like someone had touched it with wet fingers. The bells were quieter, or my ears had learned a new kind of listening. I tried to take the costume to the city's donation center downtown, but when I got there, the volunteer in the sorting room looked at the tag and said, "This came from right here," and pointed at a corner of the room where a box had been labeled in the same looping handwriting as the sewing on the costume. It was as if it knew where to go. The night before Halloween, I left the costume wrapped in a trash bag on the stoop of the thrift store under the rain, and I walked home without looking back. In the morning, my door had a small package on the mat, heavy enough to notice. Inside, folded, was the little mask with the paint flaking just so and a scrap of ribbon. Tied to the ribbon was a tiny wooden token with the number from the pageant painted on one side and, on the other, in hurried, childlike handwriting, the words, "Keep playing." I dropped the token into the trash can and I walked into my apartment, and the radio was on and the sitcom laugh track ran like a small machine. On the table there was another drawing propped against my sugar jar, another stage, and this one had a small figure drawn in the audience clapping its hands until the ink bled. Story 6. I worked the seasonal night shift at the harbor office because it paid double overtime for Halloween week, and because I liked the way the piers smelled after rain, like salt and oil and something that had been meant to be there a long time. The town ran a lantern tour every year where people brought battery lanterns and a volunteer would point out old boats and tell the same boat stories to whoever wanted to listen. It was touristy, but honest, and the tourists liked the river lit up like a row of slow stars. My job was simple: check tickets, keep the walkway clear, and lock the gate at the end of the night. That year, the tour ended late, later than anyone planned, because half the group decided they wanted to try another round. The volunteers left in pairs, the lanterns bobbing. I had my keys and a thermos of coffee, and I was leaning on the rail when I heard a laugh from under the pier. It was small and high, like a kid's laugh, and the way the water swallowed it made the sound feel like a thing dropped through a grate. There were still families milling around, so I thought a kid had slipped under to chase a crab, or someone was playing dumb games after dark. I called out to the walkway, joking that there would be no midnight swims, and a couple of teenagers shouted back and waved. The laugh stopped. When I locked the gate, I walked the shorter path along the pilings, because it was quicker, and nobody was supposed to be down there after hours. The underside of the pier smelled of wet wood and green algae. I kept my flashlight low because I liked the way the beam cut the dark into useful shapes. On the third piling, I saw a tiny red boot wedged in a crack where the piling met the deck. It was a child's rain boot, scuffed and small, the kind that squeaks if you step in a puddle. Someone had tied a scrap of orange ribbon to it, so it hung like a charm. My hand froze on the rail. People lose things near the water, shoes especially, but the ribbon looked deliberate, like someone had left it there on purpose. I picked the boot down and found a folded scrap of paper stuffed inside it. The handwriting was careful and small. It read, "I wait by the lights." No name, no phone number, just that single line. I knew the town's old stories, the local ways of making meaning out of small things, and I also knew that the harbor had its own darker stories that people told over beers. Still, a child's boot with a note like that is not the sort of thing you ignore, even in a place full of relics. I put the boot in my coat and walked back to the office, thinking I would hand it to the police in the morning. The office had an old radio that kept stations fuzzy and a corkboard filled with lost and found flyers. I stuck the boot on the desk while I finished my log and made a list of the boats out. The night settled around me. The last of the lanterns glowed like embers on the river. I was closing the tall window when something moved at the edge of the glass. At first I thought it was the reflection of a lantern, but then I saw a small face, pale as a moth, pressed to the outside of the window. The face did not blink. It was a brief thing. I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding, and the face was gone when I stepped closer. I called out, voice flat and practical, because it felt better to be practical. No answer. I turned off the light and opened the door, and the cold hit like a signboard. The boot in my coat felt ridiculous and heavy. I walked the dock slowly with my flashlight and counted the house light reflections on the water because counting distracts from small private fears. Near the old skiff, where the lantern tour usually tied off, there were fresh, small footprints in the sand, leading from the edge of the pier to the water and back. They were child's size, rimmed with seaweed. I followed them until the sand gave way to grass and the prints ended at the base of the pilings, right where the boot had been. There was no further track into the town. You do not get used to seeing a place someone else has been and not knowing how they left. I handed the boot and the note to the harbor patrol the next morning because that was the right thing. The officer on duty looked at the scrap and then at the logbook and said matter-of-factly that the town had an open file from the 1970s for a child who had been seen playing near the piers and never came home. The file was old and frayed but public, and the missing boy's name matched the town's oral history like a rumor and a fact tangled together. The officer said the case had never been solved, that sometimes the tide keeps its secrets, and he said it in a voice that did not invite follow-up. I put the boot in evidence because the rule is to put things where someone else can hold them. People at the dock started telling their own versions of the thing like they were arranging pieces on a table. The radio guy said he had caught a squeak on a late tape from decades ago that sounded like a child's shoe. The festival volunteer said she'd seen a small shadow at the edge of her lantern's light. A fisherman swore he had once reeled in a rubber boot that banged against the hull and then, when they pulled it up, was empty and dry. Story fragments. They do not add up to anything solid, but they do make a shape. On Halloween night, the harbor hosted the lantern tour again, and more people came than usual. I had to run the gate because the seasonal boss got sick and could not come in. Lanterns bobbed along the river like low, slow meteors. Halfway through the route, a woman near the bow pointed and frowned because a small figure stood at the rail ahead of us, pale as the moon, and for a second everyone thought a costumed kid had sneaked toward the water. The guide moved the boat closer and said, "Hey there, you okay?" The figure was still. It wore what looked like a raincoat from another era, a dull yellow, and when the guide shone a light on it, the thing at the rail turned its head toward us. Hollow eye holes, no movement of fingers. A moment later it was gone, as if someone had erased it with a careful hand. People talked afterwards, and the internet filled with shaky videos and photos from tourists. And they all had the same problem. Compression washed the details out like bleach. The face was always a blur, or a smear, or nothing at all. The harbor patrol went down the pier with flashlights while I watched from the office under a strand of blinking lights. They found the boot again, wedged on a different piling, the same ribbon tied to it. Someone had taken a photo of it. The boot had no water inside, and the ribbon was slightly damp where it touched the wood. That night I did not sleep well because I dreamt of being small and standing barefoot on the dock with a lantern, asking the water if it would give anything back. When I woke, I found a paper boat folded from the back of a fishing license on my desk. Someone had written a line on it in pencil, so faint I almost missed it. I wait where lights go out. No name, no signature. The police reopened the file because tourists were talkative, and because when strange things happen, everyone remembers that the town has an unsolved past. They took statements and asked me if I had seen anyone suspicious, and my answers sounded thin in my mouth. The harbor patrol checked the boats and the old boathouse and the drains and found nothing except the usual things: algae, an old fishing hook, a plastic milk crate. The evidence room had the boot tucked in a plastic bag with a note attached, and for a while it sat like an object with no address. A week later, I walked the pier at midday to clear my head because the lights and the stories weigh on you until you move. The tide was low and the pilings stood like dark teeth. There was a small patch of sea glass near the base of a piling that I thought was ordinary until I saw a pale shoe print pressed in the muck beside it. The print was full, like someone had stood there with wet feet and then stepped off into the mud. The way the print curled told me the person had been dragged forward, toward the water. There were no other prints. I took a photo with my phone because you do these things now. You make evidence of what your eyes want to forget. When I blew it up later, the print had a faint outline of a child's palm where the foot had pressed down on the sand. It was wrong and impossible, and it made the back of my neck prickle. I kept finding small things after that, not on a weekly schedule, but in the pattern of nights that make your life a little less predictable. A child's ball in a bale of seaweed, left unsoaped and clean. A tiny paper kite, stuck on a nail. A postcard folded into a bottle that washed up past the light. None of it would have amounted to proof, only a string of small, private annoyances, except that the items were all dated around the same mid-October over the years. Like a calendar someone could not stop marking. I started to clock my shifts for the weeks when the tide pulls old things free. The harbor patrol never found what you might call the answer. The town put up more lights and more signs warning people not to leave the docks after dark. The missing file stayed open, because some things do not close even when you want them to. Tourists came with cameras on Halloween, and sometimes they caught a smear of white in the frame, sometimes they did not. A few brave people said they felt watched when they stood at the rail at night, and some of the tourists left small toys on the pilings like offerings.